Hello, everyone. First off, I'd like to welcome everybody today to this virtual talk about heavy metal and horror films. I'd like to thank you all for stopping by this afternoon, and I hope that in this time of uncertainty and chaos, and perhaps feeling a bit like a horror movie itself, I can serve at least as some sort of distraction. I would also like to thank the Columbia Museum of Art, and in particular Wilson Baim and Jackie Adams for their invitation to give this talk. Being a part of the It's Alive experience has been a privilege for me, and I'm honored to be here representing the museum today. My name is Jeremy Polley, and I'm currently head of the Music Industry Studies and Music Area Coordinator at South Carolina State University. I received my master's in guitar performance and music history from the University of South Carolina. I'm currently working on my doctorate in guitar performance at USC. I've been involved in heavy metal, performing, studying, and writing about it since I was in high school. One of my favorite topics to teach has been on the history of heavy metal, and when I was presented with this opportunity to give the talk, I leapt at the chance. The connection between horror and heavy metal runs deep, and this talk today is intended to give you an introduction to the main points of crossover between the genres. It is my hope that you find this talk informative, and that it inspires you to seek out more moments of interchange between these two mediums. So perhaps the best place for us to start this conversation today is with the museum and the It's Alive exhibit. Curated from the personal collection of Metallica guitarist Kirk Hammett, the It's Alive collection spans a century of silver screen horror memorabilia. So intense is Hammett's love for horror films that he has a recurring theme of recreating some of these iconic horror posters on his signature ESP guitars, several of which are in the It's Alive exhibit. This co-opting of horror iconography in the realm of heavy metal isn't something unique to Hammett, however. Today, we're going to discuss the connection of horror films and heavy metal, exploring how the usage of imagery, concepts, and sounds in both realms has formed something of a symbiotic relationship. The obvious place for us to start would be Birmingham, England, at the end of World War II. But I want to take a moment and step outside of the realm of heavy metal to briefly discuss the original shock rocker, Screamin' Jay Hawkins. A classically trained pianist, Jay Hawkins' recordings of I Put a Spell on You in 1956 opened up an entirely new persona.
1, 2, 3.
I Put a Spell on You was initially intended to be a sultry ballad, but after a few too many drinks in the recording studio, it came out as something more guttural, aggressive, and otherworldly. This recording, considered one of the 500 most important rock songs ever recorded, was actually banned from airplay due to its overtly sexual nature. Never one to miss an opportunity, Cleveland area radio DJ Alan Freed of the Moondoggers and of the infamous first ever rock concert offered Hawkins $300 to come out on stage in a coffin. After initially refusing the offer, Hawkins relented and set forth on a wild and storied career. For the purposes of this discussion, I just want to focus on the stage performances that Hawkins adopted, and as you see in the video, rubber snakes, voodoo imagery, and a smoking skull on a stick. Granted, a large amount of this was over the top in a comic sense, and he was often referred to as being the Black Vincent Price. But the mold of horror and rock had been established, just perhaps not where we expected. So let us fast forward then to Birmingham, post-World War II. I often find that we talk about the early days of rock and roll, and therefore heavy metal. We wind up having to have some discussion about World War II. While the continental U.S. avoided direct attacks from the Axis forces in the Second World War, our allies in Europe were not so lucky. Unimaginable devastation was visited upon cities across England from the bay doors of Luftwaffe Junkers, with little attention paid to whether targets were military or civilian. An entire generation was raised in the bombed-out shells and poverty of the reconstructing England, and it is from those beginnings that we find the roots of rock and roll. While a group of skiffle-playing teens emerged from the former naval center of Liverpool, just an hour or so south by a collection of country roads that wasn't quite yet the M6, sat the city of Birmingham. During the war, Birmingham had been a center of production for material, particularly ammunition and jet parts. It was for this exact reason that the Germans blitzed the city between August of 1940 and April of 1943. This extensive bombing campaign stretched over 365 alerts, 77 air raids, over 5,000 high explosive bombs, and totaled 2,241 deaths and nearly 4,000 injuries. 12,000 houses, 300 factories, and 200 other structures were destroyed. So immense and intense was the scale of destruction that it left a lasting impression on the next generation of Birminghamites. Among that next generation was a young John Michael Osbourne, Anthony Iommi, Terence Butler, and Bill Ward. Having been entranced at the rise of their northern peers, the Beatles, the Birmingham Quartet started off being known as the Polka Tuck Band, and briefly went by the title of Earth. Now, according to legend, because, come on, what's a horror story without some legend in it? The band, which fit into the vein of psychedelic blues rock, had a rehearsal space next to a run-down movie theater. That theater specialized in horror films, particularly the B-horror film genre. One of the films playing there was Black Sabbath, starring Boris Karloff. Now here's where the story split. Either John Michael, now known as Ozzy, saw the film and was inspired to riff on the themes in the face of the rising conflict in Vietnam, or Terence, now referred to as Geezer, had a vision of a black figure of the film standing at the foot of his bed. Regardless of the how, the newly minted Black Sabbath released their self-titled album, Black Sabbath, featuring the lead-off track, Black Sabbath, in February of 1970. Ah, yes, the rarely seen rock and roll hat trick. Starting off with the cinematic tolling of church bells as a thunderstorm rolls in, Tony Iommi, guitarist, plods in with his signature detuned guitar, sounding the interval of a tritone, the devil's own interval. Now, the lyrics are filled with references to the occult. The accusing point of a black-robed figure, secret desire, Satan, flames. It's all there within the first 5 minutes. While the rest of the album shows a stronger presence of Sabbath's psychedelic roots, it was the title track that foreshadowed the coming musical output. Paranoid and Iron Man both presented stories that would be at home in the cinema. Side note, the story of Iron Man has nothing to do with the Marvel comic book hero, but is instead a wayward time traveler who finds himself trapped, mute, in an iron shell after viewing forward in time and viewing the apocalypse. From here, the gates were opened. Groups such as Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, and others would become what's known as the new wave of British heavy metal, or Nawabum for short, which really isn't all that much easier to say. This style of metal was an outgrowth of the psychedelic era and hippie aesthetic. Notice how the pictures we saw of Black Sabbath, they look like a band that could have played at Woodstock, while also serving as a backlash against cultural norms. The mantle of horror carries on here outwardly in the names and logos of the bands themselves. Pagan Altar, Venom, Cloven Hoof, Samson, Demon, Angel Witch, Holocaust, and Blitzkrieg. The music itself was apolitical, again, a reaction to the prevailing trends in the 1970s. It was instead laced with topics from the occult, mythology, science fiction, and yes, horror films. For instance, take Am I Evil by Diamond Head, a Holtz Planet-inspired violent fantasy about a young man slaughtering his village after watching his mother being burned at the stake on suspicion of being a witch. That is actually a song that was covered by Metallica at the start of their careers and became one of their more well-known covers. Now, corpse paint. There were visual aspects of heavy metal that connected to film as well during this time. The concept of corpse paint, popular in Swedish death metal bands in the 1990s, actually has its roots with performers such as Kiss and Alice Cooper. Corpse paint is the practice of painting one's face with white cake makeup and then using a variety of patterns to paint around the eyes and mouth, creating the impression of a skull or even a monster. And while one might balk at the concept of referring to Kiss as heavy metal or horror, It should be kept in mind that Gene Simmons, using the identity of the Demon, stage attire included bat wings and a spot in the show where he would levitate and spit blood while playing a bass solo. Alice Cooper, on the other hand, brought the horror movies directly to the stage. Upon changing his name to Alice Cooper in 1968, Vincent Fournier decided that he needed to change his image. His inspiration came from several popular horror films, ones that are actually featured in the It's Alive exhibition, namely Whatever Happened to Baby Jane and Barbarella. The face paint he used was adopted from the caked-on makeup worn by Bette Davis, and the long leather boots with switchblades coming out of them was lifted from the Great Tyrant in Barbarella. The horror film ethos carried over to Cooper's 1971 stage show, where he would be tortured in various medieval devices and eventually executed via electric chair every night. As Cooper's popularity grew, so did the outrageousness of his stage show, bringing horror film tropes to life, such as monsters, masked killers, snakes, and brutal deaths, night after night, much to the chagrin of local leaders, of church, and politicians. This is a short clip of a live performance of Welcome to My Nightmare by Alice Cooper in 1979, where, well, I'm going to let you determine exactly what is going on here. It should be noted that while Cooper's stage show was ripped right from a slasher film, his lyrical content was tame compared to most of the new wave of British heavy metal acts, aside from Cold Ethel, of course. The connection between heavy metal and horror films in the mid to late 70s stretched beyond creepy band names and dark occult-based lyrics. During the 1970s, cinema shifted towards a darker, more realistic takes on horror, giving us films such as The Exorcist, the original Halloween, The Omen, The Brood, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Alien. We may not see much direct connection between the two genres during this period. I refuse to acknowledge Kiss and Phantom of the Park as a horror film, but there is a common thread that runs between the two. For many teenagers in the 1970s, heavy metal allowed a sense of identification with the other. The concept of the other runs through horror films, and Hammett himself has commented on how the representation of the other is what drew him to horror films. Writer Robert Walser states that horror films have tended to resurge in popularity in cycles, coinciding with social strain and disorder. Because of this, the rise of horror films and heavy metal and popularity are synchronized, as we see with new wave of British heavy metal and late 70s horror cinema. Walser continues, metal and horror form the twin cultural spearhead, helping regular folks make sense of the chaos around them. The new wave of British heavy metal had a culture surrounding it that was largely apolitical, that was unified in unwillingness to conform to mainstream norms. The roots of metal reach back to the bombed-out streets of Birmingham, where flower power was rejected. The sun was not shining, and the sky was not blue. It was dark, the sky was gray, and it never stopped raining. What metal provided was power for the powerless for what many saw as a bleak reality. Horror films reflect this theme as well, pitting characters who are strange in appearance or behavior against society as a whole. In the end of both stories, in horror and in heavy metal, there is no happy ending. While the 1970s were a time of realistic horror films and parallel paths with metal, the 1980s found both art forms reaching their height and coming together. The 1980s was a bloody heyday of heavy metal and horror films, fueled in no small part by the satanic panic that swept the country. This panic started with the concept of stranger danger that came from things such as the Tylenol murders, the trick-or-treat scare, and the rise of missing children in Middle America. Desperate to put a face to the cause of these societal woes, figures such as Jerry Falwell, Geraldo Rivera, and Lawrence Pasdar pivoted to the rise of mainstream interest in the occult, most often found in heavy metal music and horror movies. Though the pencil and paper role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons came under fire as well during this period. Heavy metal and horror films were both seen as being tools of the devil, to be utilized by the Church of Satan to turn impressionable young minds into corrupt vessels who could think of little more than human sacrifice and sex. But as we all know, telling kids they shouldn't like something just makes them like it more. What this creates then in the 1980s is a boom of horror films with instantly recognizable names and characters. Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, The Fly, Motel Hell, Fright Night, Hellraiser, Gremlins. Yeah, okay, maybe not that one. And heavy metal was bigger than ever, responding to the new wave of British heavy metal here in America with the rise of groups like Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax, Megadeth, Armored Saint, and Bon Jovi. Yeah, okay, maybe not that one either. But notice the number of bands with names that echo themes of horror and war. In the 1980s, then, we see direct crossovers happening between heavy metal and horror films. There is Rock Zombies, where a resurrected metal band defeats a horde of Nazi sex fiends. I said that correctly. Trick or Treat is an interesting entry with cameos from both Ozzy Osbourne and Gene Simmons, where a young man is devastated by his loss of his rock and roll idol, unwittingly bringing him back from the dead by playing his records backwards. And of course, there is the heavy metal horror film, Heavy Metal, from 1981. Combining eroticism and science fiction horror into an animated anthology, the soundtrack for Heavy Metal featured Sammy Hagar, Blue Oyster Cult, Nazareth, and Black Sabbath. The 1980s gives us a wealth of crossover between heavy metal and horror films. For example, heavy metal musician John Michael Thor starred in Rock and Roll Nightmare, while Alice Cooper had a starring role in Monster Dog. The Stephen King film Maximum Overdrive featured a soundtrack almost entirely performed by Australian heavy rockers AC/DC in 1986. The third Nightmare on Elm Street, released in 1987, featured music from heavy metal artist Dokken. Now, the wave of heavy metal and horror films in the 1980s is an offshoot of the popular rocksploitation genre, which stretches all the way back to the films the Beatles shot in the 1960s. For our purposes, we can see this shift in the dynamic of the relationship between the two genres. Prior to 1980s, heavy metal was referring to horror films. In the 80s, we are seeing the adoption and recognition of heavy metal as a theme of horror itself. The long hair, face paint, and growling vocals had become shorthand in horror films due to mainstream association between the two. I feel that I should note here that mainstream audiences had a complicated relationship with heavy metal in films. It was either satanic, as we see in the movies we've mentioned previously, or representative of slacker society. It could be argued that this trend in films started with the film Spinal Tap, to be followed by Shock 'Em Dead, the most excellent Bill and Ted films, and of course, Wayne's World. I would be criminally remiss not to add Airheads to the slacker metal movie column. As heavy metal progressed through the 80s and into the 90s, it began to shift fundamentally due to the widespread acceptance afforded the genre via MTV. While there were still stalwarts who carried the torch of blue-collar hard rocking with a dash of leather and spikes, mainstream metal bands adopted some aspects, such as face paint and leather, but eschewed the darker, more violent sounds for something more plausible. This shift is what is referred to as hair metal. We find the connection between heavy metal and horror is lessened dramatically during this period. In fact, the evolution of metal leads to the next wave of music. The over-the-top, musically polished, and hypersexualized metal gives way to the grunge wave. It could be argued that in the 1990s, metal had largely gone dormant. For the most part, horror as a genre mirrored this shift. Franchises established in the 1980s continued with questionable success in the 1990s. Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th series are prime examples of that point. But horror shifted from the dark, gritty occult concepts of the 1980s to the teen horror genre, with films such as Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, The Craft, The Faculty, Urban Legend, and Final Destination. These movies all provided massive box office receipts, but there was a tonal shift in how the horror was presented. With this change of tone in horror films, we also see a change in the music used. Heavy metal found itself replaced by alternative and pop punk on most soundtracks. If the 1980s were the bloody metal heydays of horror, the 1990s were the darkest, or should we say brightest, hours. But of particular note of this era would be Marilyn Manson. Marilyn Manson, formerly known as Brian Warner, created an alter ego that was equal parts horror movie monster and Bowie-like androgynous superstar. All the members of Marilyn Manson's band adopted a composite name with the first name of a supermodel and the last name of a serial killer, giving us Daisy Berkowitz, Olivia Newton-Bundy, Twiggy Ramirez, and Zsa Zsa Speck. Manson himself adopted the persona of a gothic horror movie creation who would stalk about the stage on mechanical stilts. Their music videos reflected the ethos of horror films in the 1970s, such as The Beautiful People. There can be some argument made that Marilyn Manson falls under the category of industrial rather than heavy metal, but in reality, industrial metal serves as an offshoot of heavy metal that surfaces in the late 80s with groups such as Ministry and Nine Inch Nails, both bands who show strong influence of horror films in their ethos as well. Now, I would argue that this trend of dormancy in the relationship between heavy metal and horror films remains until around 2003, when Rob Zombie makes his directorial debut with House of a Thousand Corpses. Rob Zombie had started in the band White Zombie in 1985. A student at the Parsons School of Design, Rob Zombie was fascinated with horror films from a young age. Naming his band after the Bela Lugosi film, Zombie crafted music that wove B-horror film concepts among crunchy industrial guitars with a polished pop edge. Going solo in 1997, Zombie sought to incorporate more popular genres into his music, creating an industrial hip-hop sound over which his growled monster stories were emphasized by samples lifted directly from the golden years of horror cinema. Rob Zombie's stage shows riffed heavily upon the performances of Alice Cooper, featuring rubber monster suits and various accoutrements of horror films. It was therefore little shock to most people when it was announced that Rob Zombie would be directing a horror film. Now, House of a Thousand Corpses may not be a perfect film, but it harkened back to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre and other grindhouse-style horror films. The soundtrack features music from Zombie himself, but also unlikely additions, such as country musician Buck Owens, and an industrial rock remake of the Commodores' Brick House, featuring a rapped verse by hip-hop artist Trina. Corpses would be the first in an anthology of movies based around the same characters. The horror film industry also shifted its focus at this time, turning to a style of films some refer to as slasher horror or even torture porn. Films such as Saw and Hostel series came shortly thereafter. Along with the viscerally intense visuals, we find a return to the usage of heavy metal on these soundtracks as well. Of note from this period is the film Queen of the Damned, based loosely on the Anne Rice novel of the same name. This vampire film stars hip-hop artist Aaliyah, but the real musical connection was the soundtrack, written and performed by John Davis, singer of nu metal group Korn. In Damned, music plays a central plot point due to the fact that the title character is drawn to the vampire Lestat through his heavy metal performances. The soundtrack for the film, which also featured Marilyn Manson, Disturbed's David Draymond, and Linkin Park's Chester Bennington, amongst others, spent several weeks in the Billboard Top 10. But while horror films rose to the top of the box office, heavy metal had assumed a place in the musical subculture. The trends that peaked together in the 1980s had gone their separate ways in the popular zeitgeist, but the connection between the two remained strong. I find it interesting how these two genres in different mediums have become so closely linked. Given the nature of this talk, we are very limited in scope, but there are more arguments to be made for this connection. One could analyze the scores of horror films to find musical themes and cues that are echoed in heavy metal music, and vice versa. The use of heavy effects in heavy metal to create unnatural noises that'd be found in horror films. There is also the matter, of course, of lyrical content for heavy metal, which is thematically based on the occult, but oftentimes make direct references to horror films. Often heavy metal musicians felt for a large part of their development that they were on the outskirts of society, In fact, everyone from Kirk Hammett to Alice Cooper, Rob Zombie to Ozzy Osbourne have spoken countless times in interviews about their feelings of isolation growing up and finding relatability in horror films. From my perspective, there is no chicken or egg conundrum. Heavy metal owes much of its origin to horror films, as well as science fiction and high fantasy, but a symbiotic relationship formed through the late 70s and 1980s where the two forms are now intertwined. I want to thank everybody who stopped in virtually today and who might be watching this in the future on YouTube. I hope that you found this discussion to be informative, and perhaps you've been introduced to a band or a film you were unfamiliar with when this started. If you have any questions, I can stick around for a few minutes, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Have a great day.